Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Food and the Book Conference, session one for Friday, October 9th. This panel is called Material Kitchens. I'm Heather Wolf, and I'm co-director of the Before Farm to Table project at the Folger Shakespeare Library. And I'm here to get our first panel started. Just a reminder that all three panelists will each speak for 10 minutes each, and then at the conclusion of their talks, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. And you'll notice there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please enter all your questions there, and we'll try to get to many of them as possible. And just a reminder that the bios of all of our speakers are available in a PDF, so I'm not going to do the full introductions. But first up, we have Deborah Crone, who will be speaking on, what is the name of the cartographic table in early modern Europe. Sorry, over to you, Deborah.
So first of all, I'd like to quickly thank Alan Greco, David Goldstein, Sarah Kernan, and Leah Markey for the invitation to take part in this extremely innovative format-wise and content-wise also, and super interesting conference. The very brief series of observations that I'm going to make is very much a work in progress. More specifically, it's part of a book and exhibition project for this is the title of an exhibition that's going to take place at Bard Graduate Center in September 2021. And it's an exhibition basically about books and things, where I'm going to present multiple copies of a group of illustrated handbooks and manuals that provide instruction on carving meats and other foods, as well as folding napkins and other types of information about setting the table and serving meals. These books were published in a number of places in Europe between the late 16th and the 18th century. And there'll also be some linens and some cutlery in the exhibition. So the points I'm going to make below are part of this larger project. One section of what was eventually published together in 1629 as Mattia Giger's Libri Trattati was brought out separately in 1623 as Lo Scalco, the steward. This book, more probably a pamphlet, the 1623 version, included what are the first table maps in culinary texts. They appear in a section that picks up themes present in earlier texts going back to the regimen literature of the late Middle Ages, the seasonality of foods, what is best to eat in which seasons, etc. Giger includes menus that are appropriate for each of the 4 seasons, each with 4 courses. He also provides sample menus for different types of meals, a fasting meal, a meat meal, and finally, and what he calls an olla putrida, which is actually comes from a Spanish word that appears in a number of early modern cookbooks, in olla podrida, which is a sort of very complex layered dish consisting of a long list of meats, fowl, and vegetables that are all cooked together and placed in the middle of a table on a large plate. A kind of extravaganza that apparently required its own choreography on the table. And here he illustrates this dish in an engraving where the various kinds of meats are indicated in the numbered list here that's keyed to the table map. 2 additional maps are included in the 1623 Lo Scalco, since meals were served in what we might call family style, with a number of dishes with different foods set out at the same time, followed by subsequent courses consisting of many dishes. The combination and choice of placement fell to the steward. Diners would probably diners would probably partake of the dishes closest to them, although they may have asked to taste dishes that were not in reach. The text accompanying this explains that a piatto ordinario was to be set on a table that measured 6 palms in length by 4 in width. So it's pretty specific, and just in terms of measurements. There should be 4 people per piatto, so the size of the table would be adjusted based on the number of diners. For 8 people, a piatto doppio was required, while for 20 people, a piatto three piatto doppio for three piatti, while for 23 piatti were required. So here is the for the 3 piatti. So in the engraving titled piatto doppio here, the proper placement of the salt cellars is indicated by the letters S here as well. So just indicating that it's pretty detailed. So the 1629 bundled edition, the Tre Trattati, not these individually published pamphlets, includes another engraving, which is this elevation, as I call it, that shows how to alternate different kinds of decorative elements on a table, as well as on the side border, the credenza here. So flower vases, folded napkins, sorry about that, folded napkins here, and sugar paste sculpture. That's what is here. And these are sort of pies, I believe. So although the description of such banquets and the presentation of menus for the meals was not a new phenomenon in the 1620s, the cartographic representation of the table, with dishes indicated on the page in the form of a schematic plan, like this, was an innovation that would appear in countless culinary texts across Europe into the 17th and 18th centuries. Many examples could be cited of this phenomenon. We don't have time here. Just to make the point that Ivan Day has observed that a schematic plan was created with text slightly earlier in an English cookbook in 1621, but there are no actual representations of plates here. This is more just a kind of very basic plan. The Giger table here is also reminiscent of images of decorated tables from the second edition of Cervio's Il Trinciante, the Carver, which was published in Rome in 1593. But the schematic, rather than representational aspect of both the Morel and the Giger, reflects a shift in the way that culinary knowledge is being conceived and represented in print culture. It is this point that I'm interested in developing, the way that visualization of knowledge shifts in the course of the 17th century, potentially reflecting broader trends. One last kind of table plan appears in Georg Philipp Harsdorfer's Vollständig bemerktes Traduzierbuch of 1652, which includes among its many sections and parts a series of descriptions of historic banquets. One banquet which Harsdorfer was instrumental in staging took place in Nuremberg in 1650 to celebrate the Peace of Westphalia, which effectively ended the 30 Years' War. Here are two maps of the tables and the seating plans for that event. While these are slightly different from the table maps in Giger, they suggest a similar approach to the visualization of knowledge. It's tempting to connect the emergence of these table plans with the broader emergence of maps, as well as the use of architectural drawings or plans, as hinted in my use of the terms plan and elevation to describe these images. Both maps and plans depended on innovations in printing, as well as diffusion of specialized knowledge of building that could be marketed to clients through the schematic representation of space reduced to 2 dimensions. Both of these phenomena warrant deeper investigation than is possible in this context, but it is important to signal that readers of Giger, as well as later books with table plans, might also have been armchair travelers and aspirational builders. That is to say, upwardly mobile consumers whose interest in lavish and performative table settings went hand in glove with other forms of virtual experience that might not have been available to them. The parallel with maps and plans may not be visually compelling, but I'm interested more in the conceptual frameworks that dictated this particular representation of space and their imposition in the realm of culinary knowledge. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Deborah. Next up is Sarah Pennell, and she'll be speaking on kitchen stuff, materializing waste and its avoidance in the early modern English household.
Can I just say I use Teams rather than Zoom, so if I completely disappear, it's because I'm a complete novice at this. I'd just like to say thank you to everybody who has been involved in organising the conference, and admit to wishing we were in Chicago rather than me in Southwest London. Anyway, waste has figured already in this conference when last week Marissa Nicosia told of a first thwarted attempt at making a strawberry conserve. In modern kitchens, we're increasingly minded to reduce, reuse and recycle with our food waste caddies and our recycling bins, although we still waste more edible food than ever before. But nevertheless, perhaps we are rediscovering a moral responsibility in our kitchens, which would have been hardwired into our early modern forebears, for whom, until well into the 18th century, consumption was not an unalloyed benefit, but rather heavily freighted with biblical portent. As Gervase Markham noted at the outset of The English Housewife, published in 1615 as part 2 of Country Contentments, mismanagement of the material flows that ran through her domain, a luxuriously excessive use of them would be disastrous. And I quote, "For it is a rule, if we extend the uttermost, we take away increase. If we go a hair breadth beyond, we enter into consumption." A war on waste, on the dangers of consumption in this modality, was thus waged consistently in the space where it meant most to the survival of the household, the kitchen. And this is the passage that Marissa referred to last week, if you were in attendance at the panel, which sums up Hannah Woolley's no-nonsense attitude to leftovers. She's very much prefiguring here what my mother did every Monday after Sunday lunch, when it was either shepherd's pie or cottage pie, depending on what type of joint we'd had. So this is where she talks about, she provides a recipe for a pudding made of cold meat, and she finishes it with this quotation: "This may be called the good housewife's pudding. They are fools who cannot tell what to do with scraps of meat. Are they any worse than the rest? If they be too fat, let them try it up for suet, else make a Florentine or pudding with it. And so you may bring it, if occasion were, before a great person." I like that I'm interested here that she refers to cold meat as somehow wasted meat in this recipe, as well as how she quickly turns this into a dissertation on the English's excessive carnivorous habits. There are other components, particularly in A Queen-like Closet, that refer to wastefulness of servants, which is a little bit more of a continuous rhetoric across the period. But this idea of the use of leftovers, of spare foodstuffs, is something I'll return to in just a minute. Now, while I don't want to reduce the ethic of waste prevention down to merely thrift, admired quality though it was in the multitude of conduct books which, like Markham's, advise the housewife to, quote, "make her circle straight rather than large," we do need to understand that it extended far beyond just the careful husbanding, excuse the term, of spices locked up in spice cabinets away from the prying hands of thieving servants or lodgers. Precautionary preservative craft preceded every creative, productive action in the early modern kitchen, whether that be ensuring a temperate environment in which to deal with dairy products to ensure they would not turn, or the watching of a soft fire in order not to burn or boil away a liquid, or by the early 18th century, the weather eye kept on the tinning in one's copper pots, which became a refrain in domestic manuals, and the regular visit of the tinker, a presence in household accounts. The regular cycle of kitchen maintenance we see played out in account books like that of the farming Latham family from the northwest between the 1720s and 1740s, or the Herefordshire spinster Joyce Jeffreys a century earlier, from the sweeping of chimneys to the oiling and mending of mechanical jacks, and the part exchange of worn pots and pans at the brazier for newer, sturdier items. These all performed precisely what Markham sought: paragons of preservation in control over the multiplying technologies to counter loss. The dire consequences of momentary loss of attention are encapsulated in William Coe, the Mildenhall in Suffolk farmer's recording of a near fatal moment of wastage. Quote, "My house escaped burning by a boiler of fat hanging over the fire, which was forgot, but my wife happily saw it just as it began to boil over and hastily taking it off." And he goes on to say that in the hasty taking it off, it spilled and it flamed up and it nearly burnt their son. So, you know, he's giving thanks for delivery from two potential disasters. For Coe, a watched pot might never boil, but an unwatched one might lay waste to the whole household, as Coe reminded himself. And I struggle to find, I have seen, and somewhere in the chaos of my record keeping, there is an image of one of the father's skillets from the late 17th century, the ones with the sort of hortatory messages cast into the handles, which has, like this much later 18th century sign over the fireplace at Cork Abbey, "Waste not, want not," sort of cast into it, which really is a reminder of that ethic right there at the hearth. The foodstuffs themselves were subject to modes of processing that likewise sought to minimize wastage. My favourite example is an early 18th century Bristol brush maker whose inventory included not only brushes, presumably some with hog's hair, and bacon, but also a live pig still flourishing in his urban yard. Even new novel foodstuff were explored to the boundaries of their possibilities, and I uncovered a recipe in a New York Public Library manuscript collection for pickled patalians, and I scratched my head as to what patalians were until I found a reference to them being a term for the small fruiting bodies on the above ground plant of the potato. Now, as you probably know, these are actually toxic, so I do hope the manuscript recipe collector did not try that recipe. But strangely, given the all-encompassing didacticism around the avoidance of waste in conduct books, many domestic manuals and manuscript recipe books are relatively silent about how to manage waste on a mundane day-to-day level where it does occur, or where the yard pig is not there to consume the spoilt or inedible foods. Yes, Hannah Woolley does lament the loss of knowledge in the early 1670s about how to use leftover meats, but that's a rare admission in print that leftovers might actually exist, especially beyond those kitchens with servants' tables, or the fantasy land of high life below stairs idiom of the mid to late 18th century, as in this updated satirical take on Swift's purloining servants, keeping the kitchen stuff, that is the fat and the grease collected in a special pot in the kitchen, as we saw in the title slide, collected by Laroon's street seller, or the broken victuals traditionally seen as servants' perquisites. Instead, they're drinking the cherry brandy, which I suspect is not broken victuals at all. Thomas Turner, the mid-18th century shopkeeper whose diary speaks of a painful relationship with the proximity of want, but also a rather self-flagellating relationship with food, solemnly records the daily consumption of the previous night's leftovers. But this is only a small window into what was undoubtedly a commonplace experience, especially in the era before long-term storage of such residues was easily made possible. And I'm wondering here whether there's a relationship between the idea of waste management as housewifery rather than as cookery, and that is why we get so little record or entry of it into both print and manuscript recipe books. Sorry. Finally, I want to suggest that across the 18th century, a renegotiation with ideas about domestic waste may well have been in train, although I would suggest that we need to harness post-medieval historical archaeologists to give this some sort of quantifiable substance. Certainly the entree more extensively into the kitchen of what Carol Shamus memorably called semi-durables in cooking and tablewares, the ceramic cooking and tablewares that replaced iron, wood and pewterwares, required new and sometimes highly ineffectual techniques of preservation to prevent their waste, such as the recipe shown here in the 1709 manuscript of Hannah Hicks from the Wellcome Library. It says, to fasten any chain if it is broken, dissolve isinglass into spirit of wine and stone lime made into powder, the white of a new laid egg, and lime will fasten any common ware, not for long.
Sarah, you have about 1 minute left.
Yeah, I'm just coming to the end. The detritus dredged up in cesspits by archaeologists does speak of waste in butchered bones or the unmendable teacup, and perhaps a resignation to the fact that with material proliferation, even the most providently run kitchen might struggle to manage and waste rather than not at all. Done.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sarah. Next up, we have Victoria Yeoman, and she's going to be talking about the food riot as a political weapon of poor and marginalized women in early modern Europe.
Well, first of all, thank you to David, Alan, and Sarah for putting on such a fantastic conference. And thank you also to Becky and Leah for their work, keeping all of us in line. I have never been to the Newberry Library, and I was hoping that this was going to be my chance. So I'm gonna have to get myself there somehow in the future. Like Sarah, I am sitting in Southwest London at the moment. Okay, so the work that I'm presenting today is on food riots, and specifically how we read early modern food riots in the archive. As a historian, most of my work on foodways has been in the field of material culture, particularly on the dining objects belonging to poor and middle classes, often focusing on those who do not leave behind texts, but who do leave behind possessions. My work on riots over food provisions has led me to court documents and legal proceedings. And the example that I want to share today is the Malden food riot. It's also known as the Women's Grain Riot of 1629. This document reveals a group of women's response to hunger and their collective solidarity in moral outrage. So amidst cool, wet weather and a poor harvest in early 1629, English and foreign merchants combed local markets for food supplies and bought up grain stocks for export to European markets. Moving extensive quantities of grain out of the country led to a delicate situation. Markets approached a shortage, the price of grain rose, and with it, local men and women voiced their disappointment in the authorities' lack of ability in protecting local food supplies. On March 23rd, 1629, a crowd of women, mostly poor, decided to take action. They gathered in the streets of Malden, which is a town in Essex. So if you can picture England and where London is, it's sort of a little bit north, but mostly east of London. So they're in Essex. They call other townswomen out of their houses. They made their way to the nearby water channel used by ships to take on cargoes. And now a striking crowd, numbering over 100, they boarded a Flemish ship laden with grain. They forced the crew to fill their aprons and their coats with small quantities of grain, basically whatever they could hold from the ship's hold. A month later, in April, authorities issued warrants for 5 of the rioters, including a woman named Anne Carter, who is the suspected leader of the riot, along with Anne Spearman, Elizabeth Sturgeon, Margaret Williams, and Dorothy Berry. their examinations were recorded in the Malden court papers, which form one of the only primary sources that I've found for this food riot. So, of course, these texts, they don't give us direct access to the voices of these grain-starved women. They are carefully mediated legal records of an interrogation conducted by male authority figures who are inclined to deter political upheaval. But they are a form of reported speech. So, for example, while examining Elizabeth Sturgeon, it's recorded that her motivation for taking about half a bushel of grain was, quote, being in poverty and wanting victual for her children. When the authorities asked Dorothy Berry, who procured you to riot, she said she had to, quote, answereth the cry of the country and her own want. So I would argue here that that is probably a direct or a nearly direct quotation, even if it's framed within a legal record. I also interpret it as a political statement by Dorothy Berry. So these records are cultural texts that can tell us about how the poor felt about food inaccessibility, their vulnerability to price changes in staples like grain. And they are also texts that record people's acute hunger and the collective actions of women to avert that hunger for themselves, their children, and even the country as a whole. These documents record their solidarity in demanding the right to subsistence and the right to survive. I want to tease out the word riot a little bit. The events of Malden 1629 are described as a riot once in the court record, but it's crossed out and it's replaced with the less provocative word assembly, which is then used throughout. Early modern legal textbooks are uncertain whether women have the ability to riot as a female collective. Basically, they say a riot cannot technically be a riot without men involved. But what women can do in an early modern English legal framework is they can assemble as a collective in political action. And this fits quite nicely into the idea of a larger body politic with mutinous members, which assemble together to attack the body, as demonstrated obviously in the first scene of Shakespeare's Coriolanus. But in wider contexts, assembly also refers to fellowship. People assemble together to eat and to pray. In this case, the women of Malden assembled in hunger, bound together through their emptiness and deprivation. They seek to preserve their own bodies through collaborative action, to be hungry together. It does beg the question why we use the word riot to describe this event. Deciding what to call something obviously shapes how we think about that thing. Riot suggests a group uncontrolled and violent, something that I would argue the evidence does not convey here. There's no evidence of violence in this particular event. Protests and petitions over the provision of food in the early modern period have been covered in great detail by legal and economic historians, and especially those interested in crime and punishment. And the work that they've done on political history, the political history of provisioning, is excellent. They have taught us that riot is not so much a response to hunger, but rather the perception of injustice. And I definitely agree with that to an extent. But I think what that work lacks sometimes is the nuanced readings from food historians and literary scholars who can read, for example, court records as cultural texts to teach us about the histories of hunger. We need work on the role that identity plays in food riot, or how the power of taste or the loss thereof might intersect with food riots, and how new food rituals were formed in the face of starvation to maintain family and community traditions, particularly among marginalized groups. So I want to finish by returning to Malden in 1629. The Women's Grain Riot, or whatever we're going to call it, in March of that year was one of the largest documented food riots led by women in the 17th century. If we fast forward to May of that year, another grain riot breaks out, and this time it's composed of roughly 300 newly unemployed cloth workers, both men and women. This riot is very different from the Women's Grain Riot. The May rioters, they start by petitioning the king. They write that they are, quote, forced to sell their beds from under them to buy bread. But they inform the king that the portions of bread they can access are too small. It's hardly enough, they say, to, quote, keep life and soul together. Here, bread has an almost metaphysical power, fundamental to the assembly of body and soul. They tell the king that they are dying, and yet they know that they are living in a time of plenty. They're aware that they are starving, not as a result of food shortage, but because the government refuses to enforce laws that prohibit grain from export. And they finish with the subtle threat, words do not fill the belly. Shocking to no one, their petition affects no policy at all, no policy change. And on May 22nd, rioters make their way to the port. They again storm a ship taking on grain. This time they physically assault the ship's crew members, and they take large quantities of grain. So this riot is entirely premeditated. Also in this riot, we have no doubts about Anne Carter's leading role in the protest. To mobilize disenfranchised cloth workers, she traveled in the days and weeks leading up to protest to nearby towns to drum up support for the cause. So Anne Carter was unable to read or write, so she solicited the help of a literate baker named John Gardner, who acted as her secretary. With Gardner, she sent out letters, again looking for support, in which she styled herself Captain Anne Carter. And I find it interesting to bring someone like Anne Carter to a conference called Food and the Book, because as an illiterate or partially literate person, she is marginalized because she is unbookish. So while Captain Carter was not punished for participating in the March riots, the authorities took her involvement in the May grain riot as a serious threat to political stability and classified the events as akin to rebellion. And Anne Carter was executed May 30th, 1629. This case study sits at the intersection of hunger and injustice, and it illustrates a group of women's response to acute hunger and their collective actions to provide in the face of state power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and thank you to all the panelists for such a great set of talks. We have some questions for you, so if you can all make your faces visible. Okay, thank you. So we have a couple of questions here, and please keep adding them into the question and answer box, and we'll keep getting them to our panelists. The first one is for Deborah, and it's from Emily Beck. And she's asking, she's wondering if, like maps and architectural drawings, you see any parallels between what you look at in table settings, etc., in the scope of similar images in medicine, specifically surgery and anatomy.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I'm not sure that the parallels would be with the table settings, but I'm really interested in potential parallels for the carving images that I didn't talk about, but that are in that same book with surgery and anatomy. And I'm especially interested in the fact that those Giger books were published in Padua, which, as everyone knows, is a very important medical school. And I've been sort of looking around at images of anatomical prints and surgical manuals to find parallels. I haven't found, the perfect match yet, and it's also, obviously, I'm limited to what I can find on Google Books because libraries are closed. But, you know, that is something that I don't think I'll be able to really pursue for this catalog that I'm writing right now, just because of the deadline is like yesterday and things are closed. But there's definitely styles of representation, and my point is that they're not limited to this one type of book, right? This is something that's happening across print culture, and I'm sure that there are parallels with anatomy and surgery. And if anyone has any great images in their head that they'd like to share with me, I would be more than happy to receive those. So thank you for that question.
I'll just add a quick follow-up to that. Do you know anything about the engravers who are making these schematics, and do they have any connection to the cartographic world, or what else? What other sorts of things are they making?
You know, these particular engravers are, for the Giger, it's not known who did the engravings. I mean, it must have been Giger himself. Probably had a series of drawings that were given to an engraver. There's other examples from books published in Germany around the same time where there are engravers that are cited. Andreas Brettschneider, Konrad Gutke is one of them. But these Italian ones are anonymous. So yes, I'm sure that there may be, certainly it's probably through the publishers that the connections are not specifically individual engravers, but the way the publishing business worked was that there would be an engraver who would work for a publisher, and that person would be responsible for lots of different kinds of books that were published by that person. So that would be a project that you'd go through the printers and the publishers rather than through the illustrations themselves. And I haven't done that for this material yet, but it would be a great project. Thanks.
Great. Okay, we have a question for Sarah from Frances Dolan, who first now knows how to pronounce your surname properly and will do so the many times she cites you in the classroom and from the podium she writes. In your sources, do you see references not just to reusing food waste in new comestibles, but also to contributing food waste to dunghills and compost piles? You're making me realize, she writes, that I haven't seen that much discussion of domestic food waste rather than detritus from the butcher in all the agricultural advice about composting.
Yeah, I think, I must admit, I struggle to find the references, even in, you know, account books or diaries about that sort of, you know, the even just the transport of, you know, such material out to either, you know, the pigs for slurry, you know, whatever. It just seems to be one of those invisible yet clearly, you know, quotidian activities of transportation to various parts. And I was thinking as I was talking, it would have been good to sort of produce a sort of map really of where stuff might go in household. And the one I'm sure Frances probably knows this, and this was actually brought to my attention by a student last year who was doing a project on contemporary sustainability programs in a historic house. And she was looking at sort of orchards, and there's I can't remember which text, but I will remind myself, and I can always email it, but it's a text about what to do with apples which were no good to store and or retain, and those are clearly cited as going straight to, you know, for the use for the pigs, and it's made explicit, but it's so, you know, unusual to see that. And I do think there is this issue of, you know, there are certain things which are just beneath, you know, documentary register because they are part of the habitus, they're part of that, you know, practice of the everyday, and yet, you know, they are so central to, you know, underpinning a moral, you know, personality of that household, that they can't be overlooked. So they're invisible, but they can't be overlooked, if you get my drift.
Thank you. Okay, a question for Victoria from Lena Bread. Is there any evidence as to the reactions of the husbands to the women's riots in England? Were hunger riots viewed as within the female domain duty because of the association of women with the kitchen and food? Or was this sort of demonstration viewed as a violation of the husband's responsibility over the household?
That's a great question. I think, so I definitely think women have a certain relationship to food that men don't have at this point. I think there is a gender connection there. I think it makes sense that women may be the first ones to riot in a sense, or have some sort of disorder, because they're the ones in charge of sort of the buying and the producing. So they're probably the most sensitive to market changes and fluctuations in price in that way. In terms of their husbands' reactions, I don't know, because so the group of women in Malden who are brought in, the 5 women, when I look into their history, I think the best way to describe them is that these are women who are known to police, if you catch my drift. So they are in and out of the court system regularly for drunkenness, being drunk in public, being drunk on Easter, not going to church when they're supposed to go to church. So for example, Ann Carter doesn't show up to church on Easter. They go to her house to say, "Where were you?" And she says to them, "You send me someone to do my housework and I'll go to church." So they have these really interesting interactions with the authorities. They're in constant conflict with them, and their husbands are as well. So I don't know if their husbands have a problem with them rioting or being in some sort of disorder, because it's par for the course, I think at that point. It's a good question though.
Great. Okay, how about a question for Sarah and Victoria from Hillary Nunn? She asks, is there an awareness of food waste stemming from the process or bringing food to market? How much were intermediaries held responsible for damage to household food budgets? I bet those ships and transport in general rendered a lot of grain unusable. Either of you can take a stab at that first.
Yeah, I'll let Sarah go first.
I think it certainly is in the sorts of responses to limitations on movement, or particularly in times of dearth, a sense in which a careful husbanding again of what there is absolutely crucial, and the accusations towards those seen as middlemen or as as hoarders, keepers of grain. It's not just about them keeping it, it's about them, sort of perhaps it being eaten by vermin, and therefore wasted in that way. I am again surprised, in terms of, I'm not an expert on markets, and I would be interested to sort of hear from those who do work on markets, just what happened, if at all, to what was wasted, apart from the blood and the guts and the so on that presumably swirled around in the streets. But what happens, is it I don't know what happens to that food if it's not sold, or if it can't be sold, or if it cannot be put on sale for the next day. So there's that is definitely part of it. I'm sure Victoria has more to say.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that. When I read about food riots, again, I don't come across discussions of waste, but you sort of extrapolate that waste must be involved. There's examples of women rioting and turning over grain carts onto the ground, thinking that those grain carts are going for an export when they're not. Turning over brewery carts, which is then sort of scattered onto the ground. So there must be waste. And I mean, with the Malden riots, these women also take their children like very small children to this riot and onto the ship, and they're getting their children's coats and hats filled with grain as well. So, and I mean, they walk very far to do this. So getting that grain, you know, having a 3 or a 4-year-old, getting that grain all the way back to their home, there must be various kinds of wastes along the way. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so we have some questions about tables and more about waste. There's a lot of interest in food waste, but let's start with the tables. And Deborah, we have 2 questions, which I'm gonna merge into like a single question from Alan Greco and Maria Ziderick. And Alan's wondering if you could say something about manuscripts and whether you find descriptions of tables or schematics of tables in manuscripts, and are they similar to printed versions, unlike maybe architectural drawings? And then Maria wonders about the relationship between cartographic views of the table and maps of garden designs. And she's thinking about how knots and parterres might be figured in early modern garden treatises.
Yeah, I mean, the question about gardens is definitely a good one, and that's something that I've thought about. I couldn't include everything in 10 minutes, but yes, absolutely, certainly parterres and especially the banqueting course in England in the 17th century was very much very similar to garden plans, and some of the images, even the images from the Cervio that I showed, there's to the extent that, you know, naturalia are involved in table decoration, they're kind of seamless. And of course, gardens are also designed. I mean, yes, there are plans that are very similar. So there's a lot of parallels. In terms of manuscripts, Alan, I don't really know. You know, as you know, there aren't a lot of, or at least I'm not aware of a lot of Italian manuscripts from the 17th century. And generally speaking, the manuscripts that I have seen don't have a lot of drawings or images in them. You know, they don't, and if they do, they tend to be kind of sketchy. So it's not something I've seen a lot of, but again, crowdsourcing moment here. If people who work on manuscripts more closely have come across them, I would love to know about it. So thank you both for those questions.
We can, from the Folgers collection, we can send you some examples that we've seen in manuscripts that are early 18th century and English, but they do show the plates, you know, laid out in a very specific way.
I would love to see those. I mean, again, this is something that I've approached it from Italian prints, kind of moving in the other direction, and maybe for another project. I mean, but I would love sometime when I can come to the Folger again, that would be great.
Luckily, they're digitized, but we will get those to you. And it'd be interesting to see, you know, if they're copying from printed sources, or, you know, the compilers of these recipe books are creating these layouts on their own.
Yeah, I mean, that's often the case, as you know, that they are copying from printed sources they have and just sort of adding them in. But yeah, great, thank you.
There's certainly one in the welcome, I think, which the early 18th, or perhaps a bit later, but that's recording with the plates actual meals. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not of the elaborate nature of a but it's still, you know, a sense of needing to somehow record that in that way, as opposed to merely a list of what was served.
Right. Well, that's what I'm interested in, the sort of visualization of it, that aspect. So that would be great too, Sarah, if you can figure out where that reference is.
Yeah, where that reference is.
Yeah. I know. It's okay. Yeah.
Okay. A question from Amanda Herbert for Sarah. She writes, "Thank you all for such a super panel. Have you come across references to specific receptacles for waste or leftovers in kitchens? What would kitchen workers use to tip their kitchen stuff into the bigger barrel depicted in the Cries of London image on your title slide?"
I think this is where we have to sort of look at all those sort of, you know, bits of small, you know, coopered ware and tubs and, you know, earthenware pots that, you know, don't get recorded that often in inventories because they are small things forgotten. they do turn up a little bit more in things like household sale accounts. So at least we can see them there, you know, and they're selling for pennies, if even less than pennies. But it's just that sort of, you know, what we don't see in the documentary record, and of course we have little visual record of, but is probably in that archaeological record, at least in terms of the basic earthenware, pots and so on. That's, I suspect, what we're looking at. There is a later 18th century, I think it's either a sandby or even it's an early 19th century in watercolor of a cook handing out a small tub, a coopered tub, to the person collecting the kitchen stuff. So yeah, it's that array of things that were probably multi-purpose for in some times of the kitchen year, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. For Victoria, we have a question about food riots from Junice Hawkins. I find the idea that food riots are not so much about the hunger as they are about perceived injustices very compelling. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that point as far as your research goes. And I will just tack on a little question to that too about, I agree with her, like the rhetoric of hunger. Are they really selling their beds? Are they really dying of starvation? Or is that, because you see that in a lot of petitions, and is that more of a rhetorical way of getting the attention of the authorities?
Yeah, that's a good question, Heather, and Judith, thank you. Yeah, one of the questions I always get when I talk about this with scholars is, but were they really hungry? Were they really starving? Like, how do we know that these people are hungry? So I think, first of all, when you read a lot, like a lot of the work, the secondary work that's been done about food riots in history fields, it sits in very economic historical fields and legal history fields. And like I said in my talk, that work is really, really good. It's very contextual. It's very worthwhile to read. But when I read it, I think when I'm done, I'm left wondering, but what did it feel like to be a hungry poor woman? Like they don't talk about food that often. And I sometimes am thinking if we could combine, the work done by literary scholars on food riots that appear in dramatic texts and poems, and the work of food historians working today, I think it would be really profitable to put those things together. So to put the food and the hunger back into what it meant to be a hungry person. So yeah, I definitely agree that rioting is about injustice, but I also believe it is about that deep feeling of hunger or starvation. And in terms of whether the people are really hungry, I think that, again, when you look at the economic works that has been done, they can trace grain shortages and grain prices to show, how much of what percentage of someone's salary they would be spending on bread. When you get up to 60 or 70% of your salary, 70 or 80% of your salary on grain and bread, I think then people are probably selling possessions, beds, things like that. So I think there is some evidence to suggest that these people were starving.
Okay, we have a question from Lucinda Byatt for Sarah and Deborah. You cited servants' perks, and this is something that frequently appears in the household accounts of a cardinal I'm currently writing about, and in the genre that Deborah also knows as well. The trope of the need to supervise the use of these leftovers develops in the 16th century, from charitable use at the back door, and later even being sold by dishonest servants. So waste management here has moral overtones. Have you come across this in England too, Sarah? Or might this reflect a religious divide?
No, it's definitely not a religious divide, and whilst there is a discourse around the mismanagement of servants, which is certainly there already it's there in Woolley. She says you must keep an eye on those servants, they will waste your food, they'll steal it, blah blah blah. It's also an expectation. So there are some theft cases in the Old Bailey in the 18th century where, the poor, defendant, servant, usually female, says, well, I just thought I was allowed to take it, because it was it was leftover pie, fat, I'd assumed it was my perk. So now that may, of course, be a disingenuous defense, but there's a customary expectation at least. And I always feel that, satire obviously tends to grow out of, an existing custom that is sort of denigration of something like that. It's there, it exists, but it's beginning to be seen as less than, it manifests itself in that, anti-servant discourse, but it exists as well.
Deborah, do you have any thoughts?
Not really, because that's not something that I've not been looking at that angle at all about waste. So I think that was really, it's Lucinda, it's a good question, and it's nice to hear from you. But I haven't, it's not really, I think, germane to what I was talking about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have time for one more question. This is a specific one for Deborah from Georgiana Ziegler. And that she's interested in the last table diagram that you showed from the German book. And it reminded her of diagrams of military maneuvers. Again, is there engraver influence here, or what's going on?
Because of the connection with the Peace of Westphalia and this banquet for the sponsored by the person who was about to become the King of Sweden, Carl Gustav. I'm sure there are definitely military overtones, and the people attending this banquet were soldiers, of course. So just in terms of the social history of it, absolutely. Again, the specific engraver for that book is not known. And there's incredible, these Harsdorfer books are like a massive topic, which I'm really only touching on in the work I'm doing, but I'm kind of struggling with dealing with all the editions and all of this. So, there may be an engraver, and it may be possible, but they're also kind of generic, I think. So it's difficult. It's not like, a portrait or something like that. So, and there are some portraits in this book, and there's some more interesting images that are not just the sort of schematic plans, but none of them are signed. So the simple question is no, but work in progress. Thanks.
Okay. Great, thank you to all the participants for your excellent questions. There are more, but we don't have time to get to them, sadly. And thank you to our panelists for such engaging talks that you gave. I definitely learned a ton. So thank you. Hooray, hooray. We are now going to transition to the next group of panelists who are up now. So thank you to the participants again, as we do some shifting behind the scenes in the big Zoom room where we all live. And you'll see some new panelists popping up soon. Thanks.
Heather.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.